The planet Arestal had once been a vital outpost in the galactic struggle. Now, it was nothing more than a barren, unforgiving desert, its skies eternally covered with dust storms that made it impossible to see the sun for more than a few moments at a time. The air was thick with the weight of lost potential, and the heat was stifling, burning through anything not buried deep enough to escape its fury. There were no signs of life, no echoes of past civilization, just the endless stretching dunes that seemed to swallow everything in their path. Kilar, once a revered commander of the Torkian military, now lay collapsed on the cracked earth, her ancient body unable to fight against the merciless elements. The Torkians were a species driven by brutal efficiency, their society built on conquest and survival. As she struggled to breathe, Kilar remembered a time when she was among the most respected of her people, a master strategist who led her fleet to victory in countless battles across the galaxy. But now, after years of service and sacrifice, she had become a liability. Her people had left her here to die, abandoned on this forsaken planet without a second thought. Her mind drifted back to the moment of betrayal. The council had convened, their faces cold and calculating, as they discussed her fate. Age had dulled her reflexes, and though her mind was sharp, it no longer matched the Torkian ideal of relentless strength. She is a relic, they had called her, a drain on resources. The words had been like a slap to her face, but it wasn't until she was thrown into the back of a transport, her wrists bound and her feet dragging, that the full weight of her abandonment hit her. Left to perish under Arestal's twin sons, no longer of use to the empire she had fought for. In the days that followed, Kilar's health had rapidly deteriorated. Her energy had waned, her once glorious body withering like a flower deprived of sunlight. She had tried to survive, searching for shelter, water, anything to cling to. But the desert offered no mercy. Her skin, a deep shade of teal, had dried and cracked under the scorching rays, and her vision grew blurry with fever. At night, the cold sank into her bones, leaving her unable to rest. With each passing hour, she felt herself slipping further into oblivion. Yet, despite the overwhelming urge to give in, Kilar refused to die without a fight. She had once been a warrior. She would not go out like this, not without a trace. But as the days dragged on, hope began to fade. Then, one day, she heard something. A soft sound carried by the wind, a disturbance like the hum of an engine. It was faint, but enough to pull her from the haze of her fever. Kilar turned her head, barely able to lift it from the scorching sand, and through bleary eyes, she saw the shape of something approaching in the distance. Could it be a mirage? Or was it a sign that perhaps, just perhaps, she was not yet forgotten? The answer came quickly, but it was not what she expected. A figure emerged from the dust, a human. Lieutenant Jason Hayes scanned the horizon, his eyes squinting against the relentless glare of Arestal's twin sons. He had been on countless missions across the galaxy, but none like this. Arestal was not a strategic location, and there had been no significant human presence here for years. His orders were simple: verify the status of an old Torkian supply station, make sure there were no enemy holdouts, and report back. He had no idea that this desolate planet would soon change his life forever. Hayes' mind was far from the deserted world beneath him. The war with the Torkians had been brutal. His people, humanity, were fighting a losing battle for territory, for survival, across the stars. It was a war of attrition, and every skirmish, every lost ship, added another weight to his soul. He wasn't naive enough to believe the Torkians were some noble adversary. They were merciless and cunning, but they didn't seem capable of what was coming next, the force that would change everything for him. As he made his way down the cracked surface of the planet in his armored vehicle, the radio crackled with static, broken up by the usual reports of barren landscapes and silent outposts. Nothing had prepared him for what he was about to encounter. The heat in his cockpit was unbearable, but the climate-controlled environment kept him functional. The low hum of the engines was the only sound that kept him company as his vehicle trudged across the alien soil. The comms gave off a sharp ping, an unexpected signal. It was faint, barely enough to register on the tracking system, but it was there. Hayes' instincts kicked in, and he adjusted his course. The signal could be an old Torquian transmitter, or maybe some lingering resistance fighter, but he wasn't here to make assumptions. His mission was simple: verify and report. The vehicle bounced across the uneven terrain, and Hayes' grip tightened on the steering controls. He scanned the area, but the landscape remained unchanged. Endless sand, rock formations, and the occasional half-buried relic of a forgotten war. The heat shimmered above the ground, distorting the view. Then, through the haze, he saw something. A figure. At first, it was a vague silhouette, too far away to make out any details. Hayes slowed the vehicle, bringing it to a halt and squinting through his visor. The shape was humanoid, lying unmoving on the sand. His pulse quickened. Was it an enemy scout? A survivor? His mind raced with possibilities. Despite every caution, despite every tactical protocol drilled into him, Hayes felt something stir within him. A curiosity. A strange tug of empathy. He dismounted from the vehicle, carefully pulling his rifle from its sling and scanning the surroundings for any signs of danger. There was no immediate threat, no other movement. He cautiously approached the figure. As he drew closer, his breath caught in his throat. It was an alien woman, old, frail, and barely conscious. Her skin was an unnatural shade of deep teal, and her body was covered in scars and burns. She had clearly been abandoned for some time. Yet, despite her fragile state, there was a dignity to her that he could not ignore. She stirred slightly as he knelt beside her. Her eyes, barely open, seemed to focus on him, and she reached out with trembling hands. Her lips moved, but no sound came out. Hayes didn't need to understand her words to know she was in desperate need of help. In that moment, something shifted in him. It wasn't just a soldier's duty that called him forward. It was a deeper, more human impulse. He couldn't just leave her to die. "Hang on," he murmured, barely hearing his own words. He had no idea who or what she was, but he couldn't let her die alone in the desert. With swift movements, Hayes hoisted her up, careful not to cause further harm, and carried her back to his vehicle, his mind racing with questions he didn't yet have answers to. The heat of the desert seemed less oppressive now, replaced by a feeling he hadn't expected to find out here. A sense of responsibility, of something greater than just survival. Who was she? What had brought her to this forsaken world? And what did this encounter mean for him? And humanity. Moving forward, the answers would come soon enough. Hayes laid the frail alien woman on the medical cot inside his vehicle, the cool air of the transport providing a brief respite from the desert heat. He worked quickly, his fingers moving with practiced precision, despite the uncertainty that gnawed at him. Her skin was scorched, cracked like dried clay, and her breathing was shallow, ragged. There were no immediate signs of obvious injury, but the state of her body, emaciated and covered in abrasions, told him this was no ordinary wound. This was the result of neglect, of abandonment, of a slow death set in motion by forces far beyond her control. His mind flashed back to his orders. Verify the station. Check for any survivors. But he had found something far more complicated than just a scorched wasteland and a Torquian outpost. He wasn't a medic, but the basics of field treatment were part of every soldier's training. Hayes injected a stabilizing serum into her frail arm, hoping it would be enough to keep her alive. Her body twitched briefly, and her eyelids fluttered, but she didn't fully regain consciousness. Hayes wiped the sweat from his brow, feeling a strange sense of responsibility settle over him. He hadn't signed up to rescue aliens, let alone care for one. He was a soldier, trained to fight and survive, not to tend to those left behind by wars fought for powers beyond his control. But as he studied the alien's features, her angular face, the deep creases of age etched into her skin, he couldn't shake the feeling that her survival depended on him. And he wasn't sure why. It wasn't the kind of question a soldier usually had time for, but he felt a gnawing uncertainty that he couldn't ignore. The hours passed, the air inside the transport growing stale as he tended to her. Every now and then, her breathing would hitch, and her frail hand would twitch. But it wasn't until the following morning, when the pale light of Aresthal's twin suns began to creep through the cockpit, that she opened her eyes. Her gaze was unfocused at first, the alien woman's pupils dilated with confusion. Hayes was sitting beside her, watching for any sign of recognition, but he remained silent, giving her the space to regain herself. She blinked slowly, the weak sunlight catching the faint glimmer of tears in her eyes as her gaze shifted toward him. "Who?" Her voice cracked, soft and hoarse like an old record player on its last leg. "Who are you?" Hayes wasn't sure how to answer. She spoke in a language he couldn't understand, her words soft, but carrying a weight he could feel. Despite the language barrier, there was something about her voice that conveyed pain, both physical and emotional. He shook his head, unsure of what to say. He paused, unsure how to introduce himself in this strange, unexpected moment. "Jason, I found you out there. I couldn't just leave you." She studied him for a long time, her piercing eyes narrowing as she tried to process his words. There was a long, drawn-out silence between them before she spoke again, her voice stronger but still faint. "Human," she whispered, the word clearly foreign on her tongue. "You saved me." Hayes nodded slowly, the weight of that realization settling in his chest. He had saved her, though he didn't know why or what it meant. His duty had always been clear: protect humanity, fight for survival. But this was different. "Why were you out there?" Hayes asked, his voice low, careful not to cause her any more distress. "What happened to you?" The alien woman winced, her face contorting with an emotion Hayes couldn't quite place. There was something like sorrow in her eyes, but also a quiet strength. "They left me," she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. "My people, they left me to die." Hayes' heart sank as he processed her words. She had been abandoned by her own people, a fate that, despite the war, seemed cruel even to him. He had seen enough of war's horrors to know how easily lives could be discarded, but to leave an old, helpless being like this, it shook him in a way he wasn't ready to confront. "Who are you?" Hayes asked, this time a bit more insistent, knowing this was the only way to begin understanding the depths of the situation. The alien woman's lips trembled as she spoke again, her voice filled with a quiet dignity that resonated in his chest. "My name is Kilar," she said softly, "and I was once a warrior." Her eyes closed briefly, as if the weight of her own history was too much to bear. Hayes remained silent, uncertain of how to respond, but he knew one thing for sure: he hadn't saved just a casualty of war. Kilar was something far more important, something he would soon come to understand as the galaxy's struggles threatened to ripple outward from this chance encounter. What she had lost, and why she had been discarded, were questions that would soon demand answers. Kilar's breathing had steadied, though her body was still weak and frail. Hayes continued to monitor her vital signs, silently tracking her progress as the hours passed. The transport was small, and the air inside had grown heavy with the scent of exhaustion, of two lives inexplicably tangled together in this forgotten corner of the galaxy. Despite his desire to remain focused on his mission, Hayes found his thoughts often drifting back to Kilar. He couldn't shake the feeling that saving her had been more than a mere act of mercy. It was as if something larger was unfolding, something he wasn't yet ready to understand. It was the following day, as the transport hummed quietly under the heat of Aresthal's twin suns, that Kilar finally spoke again. Her voice was still weak, but the words came more easily, and Hayes, though not fluent in her language, could sense the urgency in her tone. "Human," she said, her voice carrying the weight of something unsaid. "I must tell you something." Hayes leaned forward, his heart racing. He had been waiting for this moment, the moment when she would reveal the full story of her abandonment, of why she had been left to die alone on this desolate planet. But as she struggled to sit up, her ancient hands trembling, Hayes could see something different in her eyes, a kind of resigned knowledge, as though she had known all along this was her fate, and had accepted it long before he had come to her aid. "I am not the only one who was left behind," Kalar continued, her voice steadying as she spoke. "My people, my kind, the Torkians, we believe in strength, in conquest. Our civilization thrives on war and the survival of the fittest. Those who grow weak or grow old are discarded, like refuse. It is the way of our people." Hayes frowned, his fingers instinctively tightening around the controls of his vehicle. He had heard of the Torkians. Their empire was a brutal one, their soldiers as feared as they were relentless. He'd seen their warships, their technology, and he had fought against them in the ongoing human-Torkian conflict. But the Torkians had never struck him as a species that would abandon their own, especially not someone with Kalar's apparent rank and knowledge. "That's—" Hayes trailed off, his thoughts racing. "That's inhumane. How could they?" Kalar gave a weary, almost sad smile, though it was quickly overshadowed by a look of intense sorrow. She turned her eyes away from him for a moment, looking out the viewport, her gaze distant. "You do not understand," she said softly. "To them, I was an asset when I was young. I was a warrior, a strategist, one who led armies to victory. But now, in my old age, I am a burden. My knowledge, my strength, my place in their ranks, none of it matters anymore. My people will never accept weakness." Hayes felt a knot tighten in his stomach. He had fought countless battles against the Torkians, each one marked by brutal efficiency and overwhelming force. But the idea of a society that discarded its elders, its most experienced warriors, left him speechless. It was beyond cruel. It was a way of thinking that no amount of military training could prepare him to face. "You said you were a warrior," Hayes said, his voice softening, a note of respect in his words. "What else do you know? What's your story, Kalar?" Kalar hesitated, then met his gaze. Her eyes were full of a quiet sadness, but there was something else there too, something she hadn't shared yet, something hidden behind her words. She closed her eyes briefly, as though bracing herself for the weight of the truth she was about to reveal. "I know many things," she said, her voice tinged with a strange reverence. "My people, they've built weapons, technologies far beyond your understanding. Weapons that could change the balance of the war, but such power comes with a price." Hayes felt the tension rise in his chest. He leaned forward, eager to know more. "What do you mean? What kind of weapons?" Kalar's gaze turned sharp, her old features suddenly fierce as the memories of her past rushed back. "There is a weapon buried beneath this planet, an ancient device hidden from my people. It could give your species the edge in the war, if you can unlock it. But only someone with pure intentions can activate it." Hayes blinked, struggling to process what she was saying. "What do you mean by pure intentions?" Her eyes narrowed, locking onto his with a piercing intensity. "The weapon is bound to its user. It will only respond to someone who seeks to protect, not conquer. It requires a sacrifice, a true act of selflessness." Hayes swallowed hard, the weight of her words settling on him like a heavy stone. He knew what she was asking, even if she hadn't fully said it yet. If he chose to help her activate the weapon, it would change the course of the war. But it would come at a cost, one that could alter the very nature of his existence. What kind of sacrifice would it take? And was he willing to make it? As Kalar's words hung in the air, Hayes realized that his mission had just become something far more complex than survival. It had become a choice between saving lives and risking everything. A choice that would demand everything he had, and more. Kalar wasn't just an alien in need of help. She was the key to something far larger, something that could change the fate of humanity. And the galaxy. The air inside the transport seemed to grow thicker, charged with the weight of Kalar's revelation. Hayes sat back, his mind racing. The Torkian weapon Kalar spoke of could turn the tide of the war between humanity and the Torkians, But at what cost? The more he thought about it, the more he realized how little he knew about the true nature of the device, or what it would ask of him. "You're telling me this weapon is here, on Arestal?" Hayes asked, his voice low. "Hidden somewhere on this planet?" Kilar nodded slowly, her eyes clouded with ancient memories. "Yes, but my people abandoned the planet long ago, not realizing the full scope of the weapon's power. It was sealed away, hidden by those who knew its potential. Only a few of us, those who were part of the highest ranks, knew of its existence. I was one of those who oversaw its safety. But now, it is up to you, or someone like you, to unlock it." "Why me?" Hayes asked, his brow furrowing. "I'm just a soldier. I don't know anything about alien technology, let alone how to unlock a weapon like that." Kilar's gaze softened, her ancient eyes narrowing as she studied him, her words measured. "The weapon does not respond to just anyone. It requires someone with a pure heart, a heart that seeks to protect rather than destroy. The Torkins never understood this. They sought to conquer, to enslave. That is why they failed." Hayes' mind raced with the implications. Could he truly be the one to activate this weapon? He had never considered himself particularly pure. He had fought in countless battles, killed enemies to protect his people. He was a soldier, not some saint. But something about Kilar's words stirred a sense of purpose within him that he hadn't felt in years. "How do we find it?" he asked, pulling himself from his thoughts and focusing on the task at hand. Kilar shifted slightly, her frail body still weak, but her mind sharp. "The weapon is located beneath the surface. You will need to navigate the ruins of the old Torkian outpost. It is hidden in the depths of the station's core, in a chamber sealed by ancient technology. Only someone with the right essence can access it." Essence, Hayes thought, but he didn't question her. At this point, there were too many unknowns, and Kilar's insights had already proven to be invaluable. He knew he needed to help her, and the weapon could very well be humanity's last hope. "All right," Hayes said, his voice firm with determination. "We'll find it. But we need to prepare. We don't know what kind of security measures the Torkins left behind." Kilar's lips twitched, as though amused by his assumption. "The weapon has remained undisturbed for centuries, Lieutenant. It will not be Torkian forces you need to fear." She paused, her expression growing serious again. "It is the very nature of the weapon that is dangerous. If it chooses wrong, the consequences could be catastrophic." The weight of her words landed like a hammer blow. Hayes took a deep breath, his hand instinctively reaching for the map console on the transport's dashboard. The ruins were located far from any known Torkian outposts, in the heart of Arestal's dead deserts. It would be a perilous journey, but he had already made his decision. "Then we'll be ready," Hayes said, locking eyes with Kilar. He didn't know what lay ahead, but he did know this. This was no longer just about survival. It was about something bigger, a mission to save not only humanity, but perhaps the galaxy itself from a greater threat. Kilar nodded, her face softening as if relieved that he had accepted the challenge. "You are brave, human. But know this, once the weapon is activated, there is no turning back. Your choice will change everything." The quiet between them grew heavy, and for a moment, Hayes felt the full gravity of what they were about to do. His life, his very future, had just become intertwined with the fate of a species he hadn't fully understood. But there was no turning back now. The mission had begun. Hayes keyed in the coordinates to the Torkian ruins and engaged the thrusters. The transport jolted forward, carving a path through the desolate landscape of Arestal toward an unknown future. The road ahead would be treacherous, but he was ready. He had made his choice, and he wouldn't let Kilar, or humanity, down. The transport hummed steadily as it cut through the barren landscape, the rocky desert of Arestal stretching endlessly beneath the relentless twin suns. Hayes' grip tightened on the control panel, his eyes scanning the endless horizon. Kilar lay behind him on the medical cot, still fragile but stronger now. the serum and care he had given her beginning to show some results. She hadn't spoken much since their conversation about the weapon, but Hayes could sense the weight of her words, the burden she carried as the last witness to her people's fall from grace. They were headed straight into the heart of the Torkian ruins now, a place she had once helped protect, but had been abandoned centuries ago when her people moved on. Hayes couldn't shake the nagging feeling that they were walking into something far more dangerous than even the Torkians had left behind. Kilar finally spoke, her voice faint but steady as she sat up on the cot. "We're close. The station should be just beyond that ridge. Be careful." The Torkians were meticulous in their design. They didn't just build to conquer, they built to hide. Hayes glanced over his shoulder at her. Her face, still drawn and marked with age, was now set in grim determination. "What do you mean, hide?" She hesitated, then replied, "The station wasn't just a military outpost. It was a vault. The weapon is not just a weapon. It's a secret, and secrets are dangerous. Whoever tries to unlock it must be worthy of its power. But if they are not, well, there's no telling what it might do." A cold chill ran through Hayes, but he didn't let it show. He had known they were walking into the unknown. But this was something else. "So there's a chance the weapon could kill us all." Kilar's gaze met his, the ancient wisdom in her eyes never wavering. "Yes, but if we don't try, humanity will lose the war. And you will lose more than just a fight. You'll lose your future." Hayes nodded, the weight of her words settling heavily in his chest. He knew she was right. They had no choice. But it wasn't just the Torkian weapon they were walking toward now. It was a potential Pandora's box, and once opened, there would be no turning back. As they approached the ridge, the terrain began to change. The rocky expanse gave way to something more unnatural. Smooth, metallic surfaces jutted out from the ground like bones rising from the desert floor. The ruins were ancient, covered in layers of dust and debris, but their technology still hummed faintly beneath the Earth's surface. The atmosphere felt charged, as though the very air was holding its breath. The transport came to a halt at the base of a large metal archway that led into the heart of the station. Hayes stepped out cautiously, his boots crunching against the dry ground as he surveyed the entrance. The structure seemed almost alive, pulsating with the faintest glow, as if waiting for something, or someone, to awaken it. "This is it," Kilar whispered from behind him. "The entrance is secured by ancient codes. Only one who has the essence of the weapon can unlock it. You must be prepared." Hayes turned to face her, a sinking feeling in his stomach. And what exactly does prepared mean? Kilar didn't answer immediately. Instead, she stepped forward, her frail hand reaching for an odd console embedded in the archway side. "It means you must accept the risk," she said quietly. "If the weapon deems you unworthy, it will destroy you. It will not hesitate." Hayes felt a sudden sense of foreboding. The choices ahead of him felt even heavier now. He wasn't just walking into a ruin. He was stepping into the unknown, where the cost of failure might be far greater than he had ever imagined. Taking a deep breath, Hayes stepped toward the console with purpose, his pulse quickening. He reached for the controls, his fingers brushing against the cool, alien surface. As soon as he made contact, the archway vibrated softly, a deep hum resonating through the air. "Remember." Kilar's voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried a weight he couldn't ignore. "The weapon will test you. It will test your will, your heart. Only those with a true purpose will survive the awakening. And if you fail..." She didn't need to finish the sentence. Hayes already knew the consequences. He exhaled slowly and placed both hands on the console. The moment his fingers made contact with the ancient technology, the desert around them seemed to fall silent. The glow from the structure intensified, illuminating the area like a beacon in the night. Hayes' heart raced, and for the first time, he truly understood the enormity of what they were doing. There was no turning back now. The weapon, hidden beneath the surface of this forsaken world, was awakening. and it was waiting for him to make his choice. The air around the archway thickened, the glow from the ancient structure intensifying until it bathed the entire area in an eerie bluish light. Hayes felt a tingling sensation crawl up his spine as his hands remained pressed against the console. The hum of the device reverberated through the ground, vibrating in his chest. For a brief moment, it felt as though time itself had slowed, the seconds stretching into eternity. K'Lar's voice had fallen silent behind him, but he could sense her watchful gaze, filled with anticipation and perhaps even a trace of dread. He had crossed the threshold now. His fingers moved over the console, tracing the symbols etched into its surface. The markings were alien, unlike any language he'd seen before. The Torkians had crafted their technology in ways that defied logic, designed to keep even the most determined intruder from understanding. But Hayes wasn't deterred. He had learned to trust his instincts in battle. And right now, his instincts told him to keep going. As his fingers brushed against a final symbol, the ground beneath him seemed to pulse, and a deep, resonating voice filled the air, low and mechanical but unmistakably alive. Who seeks to awaken the power of the ancients? The voice was not human, not Torkian. It was something far older. Hayes instinctively took a step back, glancing toward K'Lar. She stood silently, her ancient face unreadable, but her eyes were fixed on him with a mixture of sorrow and something else. Fear. "I'm Lieutenant Jason Hayes, of the United Earth Defense Forces," Hayes answered, his voice steady but unsure. "I seek to activate the weapon. I needed to end the war with the Torkians. I'm here to protect." The voice didn't respond immediately. The ground vibrated again, and a shaft of light shot up from the center of the arch, illuminating the sky. The intensity of the light nearly blinded him, but Hayes forced himself to stay focused, his hands gripping the console as though it were the only thing anchoring him to reality. Finally, the voice spoke again, slower this time, as though measuring him. "You seek protection, but do you understand the cost of protection? To shield others is to be bound by sacrifice. Will you endure? Will you become the vessel of protection, even if it demands your very essence?" Hayes' breath caught in his throat. The question was simple yet profound, and his mind raced to understand its implications. He had faced many battles, had given much for his country and his people, but nothing like this. This was a choice between survival and surrender, between saving the future and sacrificing himself for it. Could he do it? Could he truly accept the consequences of wielding such power, even if it meant his own destruction? K'Lar's voice broke through the stillness. "You must answer, Lieutenant." The air around them grew heavier, the hum of the station increasing in pitch. Hayes' heart pounded in his chest. There was no longer time for hesitation. "I will endure," Hayes said, his voice strong, his decision made. He had come this far, and he knew what had to be done. Humanity couldn't lose this war, not when there was a chance to win it. He wasn't the hero of some grand tale, but in this moment, he understood that sometimes the cost of survival was steep. The light from the archway flared brightly, enveloping him in its brilliance. For a heartbeat, everything went white, and then, nothing. The silence was deafening. Hayes stood frozen, his body tingling with energy, waiting for something, anything, to happen. But when he looked around, nothing had changed. The air was still. The ruins of the station stood motionless, unchanged. K'Lar was still there, her expression unreadable. And then, as the seconds stretched on, he heard it, the faintest sound of movement beneath his feet. The earth trembled as the ground in front of them split open, revealing a massive underground chamber. The air was cool and damp, a stark contrast to the heat of the desert outside. Deep within the chamber, something pulsed, something immense, something alive. Hayes didn't wait. He knew what this was. The weapon. The ancient force that had lain dormant for centuries was awakening, and now, it was up to him to harness its power. "Let's go," he said to K'Lar, his voice steady but filled with determination. This was the moment he had prepared for. No more doubts. No more hesitation. Together, they moved toward the darkened entrance to the chamber. But as they stepped closer, a final warning echoed from the depths of the ancient structure, as cold and final as the silence that had preceded it. The price of power is not paid in blood alone. Hayes' stomach tightened, but he didn't slow his pace. He was already too far into this journey to turn back. The weapon was within reach, and he would find a way to unlock it, no matter the cost. The air inside the chamber was colder than anything Hayes had felt on Arrestville. It was as if the very atmosphere was steeped in age, in forgotten memories. The stone walls shimmered faintly, covered in strange, undulating patterns that seemed to pulse with a life of their own. Hayes' boots echoed through the silence as he and Killer stepped deeper into the massive subterranean hall, the faint glow from the console behind them, the only light in the otherwise pitch-black chamber. At the center of the room, an altar-like structure loomed, made of an intricate metal and stone alloy that seemed to vibrate softly in the air. Atop it rested a massive sphere, smooth, featureless, yet exuding an undeniable power. The glow emanated from within the sphere, casting long, distorted shadows along the walls. Hayes felt a strange pull toward it, an almost magnetic attraction that made his pulse quicken. Killer stopped several steps behind him, her expression tense. "This is it," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "The weapon, or the core of it. It is not just a tool. It is a judgment." Hayes turned to her, his brow furrowed. "Judgment. The weapon chooses its wielder," Killer explained, her voice heavy with the weight of ancient knowledge. "It doesn't simply activate based on need or command. It tests the heart, the soul. It demands a sacrifice from those who seek its power. You must be willing to give everything, or it will give nothing." Hayes looked back at the sphere. The pull was stronger now, almost suffocating, and yet he felt an odd sense of peace. He had come this far. There was no turning back. The weapon was humanity's last hope, and if it was going to cost him everything, then so be it. "You have to be sure," Killer said quietly, her voice a mix of concern and understanding. "Once you make the choice, there is no undoing it." Hayes nodded, his face set with determination. "I've come this far for a reason. I didn't leave Earth just to turn back because of fear. This is what I was meant to do." Killar's eyes softened, but she didn't try to stop him. She understood. She had lived her entire life bound by the ruthless demands of her people, those who had discarded her because of her age. But here, in this moment, it was Hayes' choice. He had no ties to the Torkians, no obligation to their cruel ways. He was a human soldier, someone who had fought for his people, and now he would fight for the future of everyone. Hayes stepped forward toward the altar, every step an affirmation of his resolve. As he reached the sphere, a wave of energy surged through him. His body seemed to hum with the sheer power emanating from the ancient device. The voice from earlier, deep, ancient, and wise, spoke again, its tone reverberating through the chamber like a command. "You have chosen. The cost will be paid." The light from the sphere blazed brighter, filling the chamber, and suddenly Hayes felt himself enveloped in a searing heat. Pain coursed through him, sharp and unrelenting, but he gritted his teeth and stood tall. The weapon wasn't merely testing him, it was transforming him. His mind, his body, and even his soul seemed to stretch, to tear, to be remade by an unseen force. He could feel his very essence being rewritten, burned away, reshaped into something new, something bound to the weapon's will. The pain was unbearable, but Hayes didn't falter. His vision swam as memories of his past, of battles fought and comrades lost, flashed before his eyes. The faces of his fallen friends, his family, filled his thoughts, and in that moment he realized the true meaning of the weapon's test. It wasn't just about power. It was about the willingness to sacrifice for those you loved, for those who depended on you. For a fleeting moment, Hayes felt as though he might break, but then the pain stopped. The chamber grew quiet once more, the air thick with a deep, resonant silence. He felt change. His heart pounded in his chest, but there was no fear, only certainty. The sphere dimmed, its light flickering once before settling into a steady glow. Hayes stood, breathing heavily, his body trembling from the strain. But when he looked down at his hands, he saw something that terrified and awed him at the same time. His flesh had changed. It was as though the energy from the weapon had fused with his own being, altering him on a molecular level. His skin seemed to shimmer, faintly metallic, his veins glowing with an otherworldly light. Behind him, Kallar stepped forward, her eyes wide with awe and caution. You've done it. It has chosen you." Hayes felt the weight of her words, and for the first time, he understood the true cost of the power he now wielded. He had given everything to unlock the weapon's potential, and in return, it had made him something more, something different. But now, it was time to return to the world above. The war with the Torkians was far from over, and with the power he had gained, he would fight to protect humanity, no matter the cost. The future was uncertain, but one thing was clear: the price of power had been paid, and Hayes would never be the same again.